Yusuf, king of the Moabites, hearing that Valencia had been captured and sacked by Rodrigo in this very savage fashion, was powerfully moved to anger and bitterness. After taking counsel with his followers, he appointed as general to command in Spain a kinsman named Muhammad, who was his sister's son. He sent with him an infinite multitude of barbarians and Moabites and Ishmaelites drawn from all over Hispania to besiege Valencia and to bring Rodrigo, aka El Cid, to him captive and in chains. They arrived at a place called Curite, about 4 miles from the city of Valencia, and pitched a camp there. The inhabitants of all the region round about constantly went to them with this necessary food and provisions. Some of these provisions they gave to them, and some they sold. Their number was nearly 150,000 mounted men and 3,000 foot soldiers. When Rodrigo saw so vast and innumerable multitude had come to fight against him, he was very apprehensive. This Moabite army lay about Valencia for 10 days and as many nights, shrieking and shouting with a motley clamor of voices and filling the air with their bellowing. They often used to fire arrows at tents and dwellings of Rodrigo and his soldiers, provoking them into immediate combat. But Rodrigo, stout of heart as ever, comforted and strengthened his men in a manly fashion and constantly prayed devoutly to the Lord Jesus Christ that he would send divine aid to his people. Then there came a day when the enemy were, as usual, going round outside the city, yelling and shouting and skirmishing. Confident in the trusting with this whole mind in God and his mercy, Rodrigo courageously made a sortie from the city. He was accompanied by his well-armed followers, and they shouted at the enemy and terrified them with threatening words. They fell upon them, and a major encounter ensued. By God's clemency, Rodrigo defeated all the Moabites. Thus, he had a victory and triumph over them, granted to him by God. As soon as they were defeated, they turned their backs in flight, and a multitude of them fell to the sword. Others, with their wives and children, were led captive to Rodrigo's camp. Our men seized all their tents and equipment, among which they found innumerable treasure of gold and silver and precious textiles. They thoroughly plundered all the wealth they found there. Rodrigo and his men were greatly enriched thereby with much gold and silver, precious textiles, horses, palfreys, and mules, various sorts of weaponry. They were amply stocked with quantities of provisions and treasures untold.
That was the sort of climactic moment in an excerpt from the history of Rodrigo, more commonly known as El Cid. He is a quintessential Castilian knight adventurer / warlord from the 11th century, really as the Reconquest is beginning to get picked up more and more. And his life is sort of this perfect encapsulation of this vantage point into what the war was like, how different Spanish, Visigothic, Roman people interacted upon one another, not only the Islamic powers. And to me, the best way to sort of unpack history or learn about history is obviously reading the primary sources. And I actually read a few textbooks on the history of medieval Spain. And then I went back and read from start to finish the story of El Cid, I think once or twice, actually, maybe 2 times. And it's always surprising to me how exciting the primary sources can be. And this is truly his story, and the way it is written, it is absolutely epic. It's you really can't put it down. I mean, from start to finish, the whole thing is just him constantly going to war and to battles. But again, it illuminates, it brings color to our history textbooks that you just don't get anywhere else. And so in this episode, what I wanted to do originally was I was going to talk about what it meant to be a soldier, a warrior, a knight during the Reconquest in Spain. It was indeed a radically different lifestyle than sort of the knightly peers that you see abroad. Even though, by the way, many of the knights from France, from Normandy, other parts of Europe come in and operate certainly in a military capacity during the Reconquest. But it's actually, the reason for that is, we'll get into later on, maybe in the next episode, was partly because of the infrastructure that they had set up in the Spanish kings, the incentives that they had provided to their people, where basically they're like, hey, if you go out and conquer whatever victories you have, whatever land you conquer, that is now yours, you're tax exempt. Again, we'll get into more of the details later. But I wanted to do this episode sort of juxtaposed or leveraging, however you want to describe it, the El Cid narrative. I think obviously that is just a really fun story to tell. But I think when you combine these two concepts, it makes for a better show, if you will. So that's what we're going to do here today. Stick around. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. Okay, so El Cid is obviously an alias, sort of a nickname. His full name was Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar. Another name for him was Rodrigo the Campeador, which means like the champion or the battlefield champion. He, by no stretch of the imagination, were there many of these guys. I mean, like this guy, El Cid, is like the Michael Jordan of adventure knights in Spain. I say adventure knights because it's a specific kind of knight, if you will. I mean, they literally didn't call themselves adventure knights, but they were, like I said earlier in the introduction, these were just a different breed of individuals. It's sort of like comparing a Texas Ranger versus a cavalry officer for the United States Army in the 19th century. They were both mounted warriors that used various different types of firearms. They were skilled. However, the Texas Ranger just had a special flair. He was a little rough around the edges, we would say, and his capacity, his moral. So I think there was just more wiggle room morally because he was dealing with an enemy that was constantly at the front gate. And that indeed is what we see in the story of El Cid. He was born in approximately 1045. I don't know that we know the exact date. He was born into a noble family, which obviously provided a leg up. Some individuals started very low level nobility. It appears as though, so far as I can tell, El Cid started sort of like a mid-tier noble family. The reason I point this out is because I've read a lot from a few historians that he was like this very low tier status, and then, eventually would effectively become a warlord king, pseudo king, prince, however you want to describe it. And therefore, the trajectory of his career is far beyond impressive, than anything we really see elsewhere. I don't know that it's necessarily the case. If the history suggests, or at least the narrative tells us, that he was raised in King Sancho's court. To me, if you're a nobleman coming from a noble family, being raised in the king's court as a page and a squire, you're probably doing fairly well in terms of your familial status. He was born in a place called Castile, or a region called Castile. Whatever you know about Castile today, I want you to just brain dump that right now. Castile in the 11th century, I'm going to keep using the sort of Wild West, Texas, 19th century metaphors. Castile was the frontier zone. It was the place at which the Spaniards and the Islamic armies would meet. They would skirmish against one another. It was a hotly contested area. It was where most of the war would indeed take place, particularly in this era. Kings would provide a variety of incentive structures to not just knights, but frankly anybody, peasants, to venture off into this area of Castile and basically say, hey, look, if you come here and you live here and you carve a life out for yourself and your family and you defend the frontier, and yes, occasionally bring the fight to the enemy, you will be tax exempt on certain things. Whatever booty or loot you take from the enemy or can take, it is yours. You can keep. So if you're a peasant, for example, you could go to this area, you could farm, you could raise sheep, whatever. And then if you went on a raid, let's say, for example, you were able to capture an enemy horse. Well, guess what? Your status with that horse just skyrocketed, because now you essentially have a Humvee that you can go raiding with, and you can get from one place. It's much quicker, it's faster. Your capacity and effectiveness on the battlefield is significantly better than it was. And therefore, you can collect more loot and more booty and accumulate more wealth. You can go buy some land, you can get tenants, and now you can have rent, so on and so forth. So it was this sort of ironic meritocracy by sort of military fiat, if you will, that existed in Castile. It was bloody, it was violent, but it provided a ton of opportunity to individuals that would never have that opportunity, economic opportunity, I should say, anywhere else throughout Europe. And eventually, over time, Castile literally means the land of castles. I mean, to this day, there's something like 12 or 1,500 to 2,000 castles that remain in some state of disrepair. So obviously, prior to that, there were many more castles. I'm going to get into more detail of castles, I think, in a later episode. Just to give you, I know you know what a castle is, right? Everybody knows what a castle is. The thing that I sort of want to highlight is two major points. Number one, they were forward operational bases. Okay, so it was where you organized your military force, maybe train them, supply them. You would hold on to supplies there. It served as a garrison of some kind. It was obviously a defensive position so that if the enemy was coming at you, you could take all of your men and defend this position on, typically they were sort of on hilltops. The major difference between castles being forward operation bases today versus, if you're in Iraq or Afghanistan, is they also had to maintain a civilian population. So typically the way these things would work, groups of individuals would go out into Castile. They would start some sort of agrarian lifestyle. They would build structures, some sort of village, which would turn into a municipality. And there was architectural designs and layouts that they would use and sort of recreate all throughout Castile. And then eventually they'd build the castle. And so the castle had to not only support the military fighting force, but also all of the families that existed there and fed that castle. Castile as a sort of region really started in 100 years prior to El Cid being born in the mid 10th century. So approximately like 100 years before the Cid, by an individual named Fernan Gonzalez, the Count of Castile, and he had established a new separate Christian kingdom. And like I said, literally it means the land of castles. Joseph O'Callaghan, in his book, A History of Medieval Spain, he describes it this way. He says, quote, Castile at the early date developed a distinctive character and identity. The hardy men of Cantabrian and Basque mountains who settled Castile were pioneers, filled with a spirit of adventure and self-confidence, free men and free proprietors. They firmly resisted the constant assaults of the Muslims and refused to yield their liberty to any man. Their law was custom rather than the written law of the Visigoths that prevailed in the more conservative regions of Leon. Their language, too, was different, and they developed a literature of an epic and popular character in the Germanic rather than the Isidorian tradition. So again, just to reemphasize, this is very, very much akin to what the sort of the west of the Mississippi during the 19th century would look like. Adventurers often in search of wealth or ways and means of becoming wealthier were willing to go out and risk their lives. And this was no different in Castile. O'Callaghan explains this, quote, the majority of people were settled on the land as freemen, proprietors, or tenants, sometimes commanded to a lord's protection, oftentimes not. The process of repopulation enabled many simple freemen to acquire property in full ownership, especially in Castile and in the lands of the Douro Valley. These were hardy adventurers, full of confidence in themselves and determined to preserve their independence, both from the Muslims who attacked them and the magnates who sometimes tried to dominate them. Some freemen were prosperous enough to own horses and equipment necessary for fighting on horseback. El Cid is the perfect, I think he's like the most ideal example or encapsulation of a Castilian militant adventurer. Obviously, by the time he arrives, Castile is already established. He's not literally leaving Leon to go, to set up shop in Castile. He's already there. His family's been out there. They're established. They're within King Sancho's court. However, his career is this very militant, aggressive career where he continues to accumulate wealth, despite the fact that he has many sort of moments of tragedy and falls out of the favor of his lords and his vassals. He is born in King Sancho's court. There are 3 kings at this time. I won't pretend to understand why there are 3 kings. There are, and they're all related, fathers and sons. You have King Fernando I, and then you have his son, King Sancho, and then you have the other son named King Alfonso. Yeah, Fernando, Sancho, Alfonso. By the way, if I sound confused, it's because when you read this history, it is beyond confusing because there are a million Fernandos, there are a million Sanchos. They all use the same name. Some of them are called Ordonio or Rodrigo, but more often than not, it's like Alfonso, Fernando, Sancho the Fifth. It's really confusing. So if I sound hesitant, that's why. I'm just always confused because they use the same names. It's literally like Game of Thrones. Rather, Game of Thrones is just like medieval Spain. According to the Rodrigo Chronicle, quote, Sancho, King of Castile and Lord of Spain, brought Rodrigo Diaz up in his household and girded him with the belt of knighthood. Now, belt of knighthood. girded him literally means like at this time they were part of the ceremony of going from a squire to a knight is they would have this belt. I've never seen this in a film. I don't know why. Maybe I just missed it. But they would literally put this sort of beautifully embroidered belt on the knight as part of the ceremony. So I don't know if they did the sword thing, left, right, left, whatever it was, and then rise a knight off, you're kneeling, and they would like put this belt on you. Later on, it became a term of phrase. I don't know that they would literally like put the sword belt on you. Of course, I didn't watch the Elton John. The fact that Elton John got knighted, the fact that we are knighting pop stars today is a goddamn travesty and disgrace to knighthood. I'm sorry, it just is. Elton John is talented. I'm not like a huge Elton John fan. I don't even know why I'm bringing him up, but I know he's Sir Elton John, and it drives me absolutely up a wall that they've decided that it's appropriate to knight, I don't know, pop stars, whatever. Anyways, driving on. Training for warfare began when they were children. Unlike, I'm going to use the example of a hoplite. The beautiful thing about ancient Greek warfare and hoplites, despite what some historians say, is it's a fairly simple task. You don your equipment, and I'm talking heavy infantry. Here, you have your hoplon shield, you have your spear, and there's, you stand in formation. The most, it seems when you read the historical text about ancient Greece and fighting in this manner where two armies sort of come head on and pitch battle, is maintaining the rank and not breaking discipline and fleeing. The actual fighting component is fairly straightforward. It's fairly simple. It's kind of like why today you can put an individual with a high school level education through boot camp, whether it's in the Army or the Marine Corps. And after, I think, how long was basic training for me? It was like 17 weeks, 16 weeks. After 16 weeks, they are effectively ready to go to combat, right? That is not the case with being a heavy cavalryman, a knight in medieval Spain. There is a ton of armor you have to wear. Very often at this point, we'll get into in a moment here, most of it's chainmail, but you've got an assortment of weapons. Not only do you have to know how to use those weapons effectively on the battlefield, you have to know how to use them on the back of a horse. For those of you who have never ridden a horse, this can be very challenging. When you are riding a horse, they make it look very simple in the movies, but there's a whole variety of ways of directing the horse. Very often you're using your legs or your feet because your hands are occupied. What I'm really trying to get at is it takes years. Ergo, this is why they start the process when they are very young. So you start as a page. A page is sort of like a personal assistant / you are learning court etiquette. So you're literally beginning your education of how to be a nobleman at this young age. You're bringing you're under the tutelage of a master at arms or a knight. You're bringing him his meals. You're bringing him messages, whatever, from other people throughout the castle or the municipality, wherever you're living at that time. And indeed, you are beginning to practice basic combat skills. You are assisting the knight by cleaning and preparing his armor. And like I said, you're running errands, whatever those may be, for your lord. As you progress into your teens, you become a squire. And one point that I really want to drive home on the squires, it's not like what you see in the film. Squires in films are these sort of like small, wimpy kids who are terrified of everything and just sort of get smacked around by their knightly lord, and they're kind of useless people, I guess. Squires actually had responsibilities associated with combat. So if their knight or their lord needed a weapon replaced, let's say a lance broke in the midst of combat, it was incumbent on the squire to be able to provide him with a new lance. Same goes for sword, shield, whatever. They also acted as couriers on the battlefield if need be. So if a knight is part of a retinue, they're being routed by the enemy. He may grab his squire and say, hey, go back to camp and we need reinforcements, obviously. He would continue to learn advanced combat skills at this age. But again, it's just the big thing is the historical squire is very different than the sort of Hollywood popularized media squire. he was much more involved in combat. He would even have to fight in combat, obviously, because if you're on the battlefield doing whatever it is a squire is doing, he may have to defend himself and fight. And that brings us really nicely into how a squire became a knight. At least in Spain, it was more flexible, I would say. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, it's not like they reach an age and they check the block and it's like, well, you met all of our requirements. Now you can become a knight. There were a whole variety of ways one individual may become a knight. So for example, if you're a squire, you're on the battlefield and you dismount an enemy knight and you take his horse. Well, guess what? There's a very good chance that you just became a knight. And they might formalize it with a ceremony, but you have been combat trained. You've proven yourself on the battlefield. You have a certain level of military prowess, capability, skills, whatever. And now you have a horse. And presumably, if you got that horse, you took the enemy's armor. So now you have a suit of armor. Congratulations. You just instantaneously rose up in the ranks and now went from a squire to a knight. And yes, this is indeed something that I've read in the primary sources. I believe the individual, I think he was a prince, some kind of, I can't remember what level of it. He might have been a prince or I don't remember, but he basically took an enemy horse at the age of 14 and they were knighting themselves on the battlefield. So there was a lot more flexibility. You didn't even necessarily have to be of noble birth to become a knight. This is sort of the cool, beautiful part about Castile and the Reconquest generally, because throughout the rest of Europe, the likelihood that you're going to go from being a peasant to a knight is almost nigh impossible. Whereas in Spain, there was at least the opportunity available to you if you were dedicated enough to that profession. It's sort of another way I think of describing it, why this sort of paradigm existed in Spain and not elsewhere. It's sort of like in World War II, where you had non-commissioned officers. I don't know how often it happened, but it did happen more often than it ever has happened since, where you had non-commissioned officers who, sergeant majors, first sergeants, who would get a battlefield commission. And literally on the battlefield, it's like, congratulations, you're now the second lieutenant. And that was due to the nature of the war, men being wounded, men dying. They needed officers. And so in order to facilitate that, they would have battlefield commissions. That's exactly kind of the same thing going on in medieval Spain. They needed warriors. They needed mounted warriors. They needed knights. They were in a constant state of warfare. People's capacity to wage war was constantly improving because they were constantly, like I said, going to war. And this just wasn't the case in any other place in Europe, at least at this time. So obviously I'm going to go into the hierarchy a little more specific, but I just want to give you an idea of the numbers of what we're talking about here. So at the top of the hierarchy, obviously you had a king, you had his entourage around him. And then from there, you had sort of lesser nobles, if you will. So counts, governors, mayor, whatever you want to call them. There was an individual whose name I can't remember. I'm going to talk about in a later episode. His entire job was the maintenance of the castles. All of these individuals would have, again, another group of men around them, and above a certain rank, at a certain status, they were knights. Their profession, day in and day out, was simply focusing on the art of war, or the profession of war. Within they were literally I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but they were literally called rich men. And these rich men, who were vassals of the king, they would have a retinue of knights. So they would have a group of knights around them that they could mobilize and leverage to go to war, either for their own sake or for the sake of the king. And typically, I believe at a minimum, they had to have had 100 knights ready to rip. And then some had as many as 300 knights. Now, per knight, you would have roughly approximately 10 sort of quote unquote militiamen or infantrymen in the Iberian Peninsula throughout the Reconquest. Every able-bodied man was expected to fight. Dependent upon what status or how wealthy you were within society would sort of determine what you could bring to bear on the battlefield. So, if you were part of the lower socioeconomic class, maybe all you had was some rough garments and a spear. As you climbed up the ladder, maybe you were a little wealthier, not necessarily a landowner, but you just accumulated more wealth.
through maybe raiding or any number of other things, maybe through just your job of being a blacksmith. And at some point you had a horse, but you couldn't afford armor. So maybe all you could do is you could ride your horse into battle, do raiding as sort of a light cavalryman, if you will. And you had a shield and a sword, or a shield and a lance. And then obviously you'd move up to the top tier class, obviously, were the knights. One thing I definitely do not want to forget, there was a group unique, I think, to, so far as I'm aware, I don't want to speak out of turn here, unique to the Iberian Peninsula and the Reconquest. There was a class, sort of a mid-lower class of mounted infantrymen, they were kind of infantrymen, but cavalrymen, because obviously they were mounted on horseback. Anyways, they started as infantrymen, is what I'm trying to say. And many of them started as peasants. And again, because of the opportunities that were afforded to them on the frontier through warfare and raiding, they were able to not only accumulate wealth, but also get their hands on a horse. And these groups of men that were mounted, lightly armed, spears, lances, maybe a shield here and there, they would operate not so dissimilar from how the Comanche would raid into Texas or into Mexico, where they would strike like lightning on a village or a town. They would take whatever they could get their hands on. They would destroy whatever they could. They would kill, obviously, anybody that was in their way. And then they would get away as soon as possible before the enemy could mobilize any sort of response or defense. This was encouraged by the Spanish kings. And again, these individuals saw all of this as an economic opportunity for them to rise to the ranks. These were known as, I believe, villain knights. Even though many of them would eventually become literally knights, they would eventually be able to afford, some of them at least, would be able to afford armor. And they would, again, be able to climb through the rank status structure. They would kind of be frowned upon. So I'm trying to think of like a good example of this. It would sort of be like if you're watching Game of Thrones and there is a hedge knight. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Game of Thrones, a hedge knight is sort of like a lordless knight. He's sort of like a pseudo Ronin, if you will. And the reason they call him a hedge knight is, at least according to George R. R. Martin, is because they're so poor that they have to sleep under hedgerows on the King's Highway. So these were sort of like that, except they did have villages, they did have towns that they would operate out of, or castles. And indeed, they were an absolutely critical component in terms of just the fighting force in maintaining a presence within the frontier in this, and constantly engaging against Islamic forces throughout the entire Reconquest, until really once their presence was so strong that Islamic forces could no longer mount any sort of offensive. They were constantly on the defensive. That's when you would get more castles coming in. That's when you would get more infrastructure coming in, more wealth, et cetera, et cetera. And so what was once a border region slowly over time becomes a foothold within the battle space. Okay, I've gone on and on about that. Let's keep driving on here. One quick note. I'm sort of getting way ahead of myself here, but the next season of the Dead Warrior Society that I'm going to do will be on the conquest of Mexico. A lot of what I am talking about has a direct affiliation and association of what was going on in the conquest of Mexico. And specifically, there's this obsession with cavalry. And the reason for that is because it is a representation of one's status within society. If you owned a horse, you were of the upper crust of Spanish civilization. You were seen as an aristocrat or pseudo aristocrat. And unfortunately for the conquistadors, when they went over to the New World, to Mesoamerica, Central America, they couldn't always use their horses. And it was very difficult and frustrating for them, because for generations and hundreds of years, that was the mode of warfare. And the last thing I want to mention too is the sort of concept of the adventure warrior, if you will, right? The conquistador, that again comes directly from the Castilian frontier area, where they were, again, fighting not only the enemy, but trying to push the boundaries, push the white space to control more and more land. And again, this was although at one point, yes, the Hispanic Visigothic Roman people dominated the entire peninsula, they had lost it, and now they were taking it back. And so it was in some fashion, in some way, virgin territory. Okay, so I went on a wild tangent there. Let's dive back into Rodrigo's life. He had some brothers and sisters, but when his father died, he was effectively the leader of the household at that point. He was a teenager. It's unclear how old he was specifically. And he became a knight in King Sancho's court. And according to many historians, they sort of like slightly touch on this in the manuscript, but he was very close with King Sancho. Like I said, he was part of his entourage, inner circle. In May of 1063, he's approximately 18 years old, and they go and fight a battle at this location known as Graeus, which is outside of Zaragoza. Okay, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. The warfare in which the Christians fought throughout the Reconquest was not super clean cut, meaning it wasn't simply Christian forces versus Islamic forces. There were many situations where you had a Christian army and a Muslim army fighting together against another Christian army, or vice versa. Again, so for example, you'd have like a Muslim army fighting with a Christian army, fighting another Muslim army. It was confusing. It was complicating. It was nuanced. Many historians sort of suggest that the reason, because of this factoid, right? Because it wasn't so clean cut, there weren't just Christians fighting Muslims or vice versa, and you had Muslims and Christians fighting other Christians. Therefore, the concept or the notion of a pure reconquest is fictitious. It's not real. I sort of want to touch this, and I'll come back to it later on. And again, this is one of these themes that I want to sort of bring up over and over again because it sort of proves a larger point. And there's evidence for what I'm about to say, which I'll get into, I believe, in the next episode. The Christian royalty, the lords, the military commanders, if you will, knew exactly what they were doing. There was a strategy at the highest level of basically divide and conquer. And so if they allied themselves with one kingdom, one Islamic kingdom, and could fight another Islamic kingdom, then they could basically fracture any sort of association between these Islamic. They sort of split up. They were the caliphate, and then go back and watch the last episode, and it falls apart into individual independent kingdoms. But basically, they wanted to create a wedge between different Muslim groups. And by doing so, over time, they could, again, this would assist them in taking over the entire Iberian Peninsula. And obviously, over the course of this, sort of allowing Christian lords to work alongside with other Muslim lords, you'd have situations where Christians fought Christians. And like I said, for the millionth time, and they would have a Muslim army at their assistance. What's so fascinating about the Battle of Graeus outside of Zaragoza is you had King Sancho with obviously Rodrigo, and they were fighting with an Islamic army against his uncle, Ramiro I. So you literally had Fernando I deployed his son Sancho to fight his brother, aka his son's uncle. And they were doing it, the reason for their deployment and was because they were defending a Islamic vassal who had sworn allegiance to Fernando, the Christian monarchy. Super fascinating. Like I said, totally fucking banana Game of Thrones situation here. Ramiro is defeated. He is killed at the Battle of Zaragoza. And all we really get out of this is, not all we get out of it, but one of the major features we get out of this in like every battle, and one has to wonder if it was truly every battle, that El Cid was as successful as he was, but apparently El Cid just murked everybody. He was a fabulous warrior. He killed it. He did a great job. And he would end up being promoted because of that. Last thing that I want to mention is the oath making between vassals and kings was clearly as powerful, if not more powerful, than blood relations. Meaning this Islamic king swore fealty to Fernando I, and in return for that fealty, Fernando I swore that he would defend this Islamic leader's realm from external threats, even if it was his own brother, Ramiro I. And so clearly there's this bizarre thing where, like, you know, I know Ramiro's my brother, but I made an oath to my vassal that I will defend him no matter what. And so I'm going to go deploy my son to fight his uncle, and he dies in the battle. The other thing I will say too is obviously there is monetary incentive structures there. Of course. which is to say that he was drawing a tribute from this Islamic king, from Graius. So, maybe some of it had to do with greed. At the end of the day, it's a lot like kind of like gang warfare in territory. Okay, let's drive on. After this, King Sancho promotes, according to the manuscript, he promotes El Cid to be his standard bearer, which is effectively like the right-hand man of the king. It is the commander of the troops. It is potentially one of the highest military positions within his entourage, as in terms of his courtiers. There's a lot of speculation that the author of the History of Rodrigo retconned this, that it didn't actually happen. There's no way that he would have promoted someone as young as El Cid to this position that early on. We'll never really know, but I think it's safe to say that El Cid already at this young age was making a name for himself and was indeed promoted. And after this, what we have is King Sancho actually ends up going to war with his brother, King Alfonso. The manuscript tells us this, quote, "In every battle which King Sancho fought King Alfonso at Latanda and Golpejera and defeated him, Rodrigo bore the king's royal standard and distinguished himself among the warriors of the king's army and bettered himself thereby." So two things. One, we know the brothers are going to war with one another. King Sancho is smoking that fool and lighting up suckers. And at the front of the battle is El Cid doing what he does best. Tragically, in one specific battle, King Sancho perishes. It is unclear what was the cause of his death beyond so much as to say it appears as though there was some sort of assassination, successful assassination from his brother, King Alfonso, and King Sancho passes. And obviously this is a huge blow to El Cid, right? I mean, here's a young man. He's the right-hand man. He's the standard bearer, presumably, of King Sancho. He's winning battles. He's accumulating wealth. He's enriching his reputation among his peers. And then all of a sudden his lord dies, and it's sketchy. It's unclear how specifically he dies, but based on what I've read from the historians and from the manuscript, it appears as though there's some kind of conspiracy at play. And of course, everybody just blames King Alfonso. Okay, before we go any further, I want to sort of unpack how this hierarchy works from the king down on to his retinue. And I'll be the first to admit, it is beyond confusing. Okay, it's just like I've read and reread this history so many times, and I cannot tell you how many times I'm scratching my head. So I'm going to sort of read through some of this stuff because it's really detailed. But again, I think it's really important to understand how the political system worked. What was the role of the king in terms of his obligations and responsibilities to not only his people who were his subjects, but his courtiers and the church. Joseph O'Callaghan, in his book, A History of Medieval Spain, summarizes it this way. He says, quote, "In the concrete, the king was the acknowledged head of the political community whose members pledged public allegiance to him. He had the traditional responsibility to administer justice, to guard the Catholic faith, to defend the frontiers, and to appoint subordinates to carry out various public functions." So obviously way different than the president of the United States. But as far as big picture executive, goes, it doesn't sound that dissimilar from the president, right? You have your cabinet, which would be your courtiers. You can designate certain positions of authority or specific jobs within your kingdom, your immediate kingdom at least, to your friends, your buddies. You can fire people. And obviously there are things that are totally different. The courtiers, for example, which I guess the cabinet for the president, they were war fighters, or they had to at least have a retinue of knights at the ready to go fight whatever war the king decided was necessary to fight. And obviously there's a huge religious component that just doesn't exist in the United States either. One point I want to make really clear, at least to me, when I watch popular media, film, television, whatever, Game of Thrones, it appears as though kings have this sort of autocratic, complete power in so much as what they say goes. There's really no checks and balances that exist within, like I said, film or Hollywood. That is not how the real world works. That is not how it worked, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula during the Reconquest. The king had a job. He had specific duties and obligations that he had to fulfill. Indeed, there was a religious component in so much as they believed there was some sort of divine decision that this individual was ordained by God. But there was also oath making under the auspices of the church, and they would swear allegiance to the people and vice versa. And the king saw himself as somebody who served his people, and they in return served the king. It was this mutual relationship of benefit. According to the manuscript titled Historia Silencia Ordonio, and this was in 914, Ordonio II took the throne and, quote, all the magnates, bishops, abbots, counts, and chief men of Spain gathered together in a solemn general assembly, acclaimed him and made him king, and the diadem was placed upon him, and he was anointed in the throne of the kingdom of Leon by 12 bishops. So you have all these people coming together, not just his immediate entourage or courtiers. You have people from all over the realm coming to this assembly to see the coronation of the king. But again, it was this mutual agreement of, I will defend you, I will take care of you, I will keep you safe, and in return, you pay your taxes so I can facilitate the army, etc., etc. Joseph Vaquel again notes that the ceremony, quote, usually took place in the Cathedral of Lyon, was also enhanced by the celebration of solemn mass and the chanting of the Te Deum. At this time, the king swore to govern in accordance with the law, and his subjects pledged their allegiance to him. Like I said, it was a relationship. Just to really drive this point home, in the last episode I talked about the caliphate. Although a caliph didn't necessarily have complete free reign to do whatever the hell he wanted to do, he had way more freedom to enact his rulership, if you will, on his people, and even within his own inner circle. So, for example, Abd al-Rahman III lost a major battle sort of towards the end of his life against the Christians. And in response, he ended up conducting a mass execution of 300 of his top generals and officers. And specifically, he crucified the worst 10 of them, I suppose. The point being, I don't know of anything like this within Iberian Spain. I don't think that there's any way, shape, or form that a Spanish king would, had he lost a battle and he was put in the same position, he would have lashed out at his courtiers in this way. Number one. Number two, legally speaking, I don't think he could ever get away with something like this. So it was just vastly different. The caliph, the caliphate, was closer to the sort of theocratic, autocrat rule, theocracy, if you will, where he was both the religious order. So he was again, I'm using words that do not comport to how they would describe it in Arabic. So forgive me if you are an Arab or from the Middle East or whatever. He was sort of the Pope and the king smashed into one. He was a religious order. He had all of the religious obligations that the Pope had, but simultaneously he also had the duties of a king. And this was in one position because in Islam, there was no secular and religious order. They were all just under one institution. Okay, so surrounding the king, obviously we had a council, which included magnates, the royal family, royal vassals, and other officials. And I'm just going to sort of read through some of this because I don't want to miss any of these specific points. Key figures on the council were individuals known as palatine officers, who were the royal standard bearers and the commander of the troops. So this, for example, was what El Cid facilitated this role for King Sancho. And during coronation ceremony, the palatine official held the sword before him as a symbol of royal authority. There was also the mayordomus, who were the royal administrator, or who was the royal administrator, and he collected rents. The notary, who drafted royal documents and kept archives. The strator, who oversaw the king's stable. There was the treasurer, the chamberlains, who were responsible for the king's clothing and maintenance of his living quarters. And of course, you had the chaplains, who were charged with the spiritual needs and guidance of the king. As I said, the powers of the king rested on a relationship between him and the individuals he served. There were private contracts with vassals and great men. And this relationship was indeed transactional. Vassals would perform military duties. At a minimum, they had to serve 3 months on campaign every year at a minimum. And obviously, in return, the king would provide protection for them, and most of them would pay some kind of a tribute, although there were tax exemptions for many of the individuals, like I said, who fought in the king's military force. The king would simultaneously pay a stipend to many of his courtiers or his vassals, so they could maintain their castles, right? They have to maintain the defensive posture along the frontier. The only way they could do that, or one of the ways they did that, is they had supplemental income from the king to maintain the grounds, the military, the horses, etc., etc. This was all rooted in land ownership, where the king's vassals could tax and draw revenue to support the military endeavors and their own benefits while serving the king when necessary. Something that was also very unique that I guess kind of surprised me when I was doing my research was in these enclaves within, you had the kingdom, and then you'd have like a county, and then you would have a castle, village, municipality, town situation, if you will. They were allowed to have their own fueros. Fueros is sort of like a law code constitution. In Castile, originally, they didn't write any of this stuff down. Eventually, when their position within Castile was no longer, they were no longer fighting this immediate back and forth frontier war, they had established a sense of security, legitimization. They would actually start writing out these laws. And the king would, once again, he would allow them to sort of oversee the judicial process on a local level. Again, not so dissimilar from how it is built in the United States. Obviously, you have federal law, but then each district, each town throughout the United States has their own laws. Then you have state laws. So there's different sort of thresholds. And that's not so dissimilar here. As noted by Angus MacKay in his book, Medieval Spain, he says, quote, "The king was recognized as ruler on condition that he respected the laws, liberties, and customs of his subjects. And it was only after he had taken an oath to this effect that his subjects swore allegiance to him." So the king said, "Hey, I swear I'm going to defend you. I'm going to take care of you. You're going to be independent. You can run your own lives. All that I expect in return is you are going to serve me as needed, and I can draw tribute and revenue in order so that I can protect you." And then obviously the people would say, "Sounds good. Let's do this shit." Many of the vassals, many of these offices were hereditary. So obviously that just means it was passed down from father to son. As noted in the El Cid manuscript, quote, "On his death, his son Rodrigo Diaz, aka El Cid, succeeded by the destiny of paternal ruling." Okay, one of the things I want to mention too, before I forget, I meant to mention this earlier, and I love this. So if you watch Lord of the Rings, or if you watch Game of Thrones, or any sort of awesome fantasy show, very often characters will introduce themselves as "I am so-and-so, and my father was so-and-so," right? So this is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, or Boromir, son of Denethor, right? That is a shortened version of what actually came from these historical texts. So in the beginning of the El Cid manuscript, it literally says like 10 generations of fathers and grandfathers until all the way down the line until you get to Rodrigo. For those of you who are not familiar with the Old Testament, that comes from the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, they are very interested. The authors are very, very invested in the continuity of certain familial lineages, and it sort of legitimizes this individual in his position. He was the son of so-and-so who begot so-and-so, begot so-and-so. So that's sort of the trajectory of how you get, Aragorn, son of Arathorn. It actually comes from the Old Testament, which was deeply, inspired. The medieval texts were inspired by the Old Testament. That's how all that stuff comes together. And it has, again, to do with receiving these specific offices within the court of the king. So it was specifically at the Battle of Zamora where both King Sancho died, and we get sort of our first glimpse into how effective a fighter El Cid truly was. He single-handedly fought 15 enemy soldiers, which is incredible if it was true, obviously. But we get a very detailed account from the manuscript that I'll read for you now. Quote, "7 of them were in chainmail. One of these he killed. 2 he wounded and unhorsed, and the remainder he put to flight by his spirited courage. Afterwards, he fought with Jimeno Garcias, of the more distinguished men of Pamplona and defeated him. He fought with equal success against a certain Saracen at Medellin Asali, whom not only defeated, but killed. Okay, so there are a few things I want to unpack here. Number one, 7 of the 15 were in chainmail. I would assume or have to assume that these were specifically knights or knights of, individuals of equal class. 1 he killed, 2 he wounded, and 1 he unhorsed. So far as I can tell, regardless of whether he killed these individuals, unhorsed them, or quote unquote wounded them or defeated them, it was all sort of seen as the same. He had rendered them incapable of continuing the fight. So if a knight was taken off of his horse, for example, there's really not much he could do. He no longer could move with the rest of his brothers in arms, so to speak. And therefore, he was basically naked on the battlefield and had to escape as soon as humanly possible. If someone was wounded or grievously wounded, obviously they were effectively defeated. The one thing that I guess catches my attention is if you had a guy who was on a horse, presumably he would be easy to kill. Why wasn't he killed? If you had 2 individuals that were wounded, why didn't he just kill them? And this, again, sort of speaks to how Christians fought predominantly during this epoch. Obviously, when you watch films of this type of warfare, so far as I'm trying to think back of like every medieval movie I've ever seen, I can't even think of a single time when they're not simply trying to kill the enemy, or in every scene that is the end state, right? That's where they're trying to get to in the film. Realistically, in this world, taking hostages was was sort of the modus operandi for many, if not most, knights. I remember I read this book called, I think it was called The Greatest Knight That Ever Lived. It was about William Marshall, who was a knight in Europe. And one of the things the author pointed out in this book is that knights were not really looking to kill their enemies on the battlefield. More often than not, they were just trying to capture them and hold them as hostage. Why? Well, because by getting a ransom, an individual, whether he was a knight or someone, a courtier of some kind or a vassal, he was worth a ton of money to both the family and the king that he worked for. And therefore, they presumably would typically pay a handsome reward for his return. And so very often these men would be held as prisoners. There would be some sort of exchange of words until finally, it could be months, it could be weeks. The one thing I will say though is, and I don't have any sort of stats to back up this conclusion, this is just something that comes through the research and the primary source material as I'm going through it. It seems as though more often than not, the Iberian Peninsula was a far more violent area than the rest of Europe in this period, in this moment of time. And individuals were more likely to kill their enemy than take them ransom. Now, obviously, El Cid and his compatriots, the men that worked with him and his enemies, very often did take hostages. Again and again, when I'm going through the primary source material and the history of Rodrigo, he will sort of take captives, but very often the author just notes that he just takes their stuff from them and then eventually lets them go. I think potentially this has something to do with just the nature of frontier war. Taking hostages may not have been as accessible in so much as like you are raiding along the frontier, you take some hostages, but you want to continue your raiding and you can't just return back to your garrison or your castle. Taking those hostages with you would be kind of a giant pain in the ass. And so presumably very often they would just leave them there. Is it a coincidence, by the way, that he ends up defeating and then killing the Saracen? Probably not, right? It specifically says whom he not only defeated, right? So at some point, this individual, this knight was done. He couldn't fight back. And then the author specifically states that he was killed. So was there a sense of was there more violence and aggression towards Saracens on the battlefield or Muslims? It very well may be the case. With all that said, let's take a brief moment and talk about all the fun stuff, how individuals fought on the battlefield. We've sort of already talked about who was there, right? We had the knights, we had some light cavalry as well, and then the militia or the infantry. Knights were typically in this period armed with chainmail from top to bottom. They would wear a hood, and then there was this face guard, if you will, that came around and clasped. I can't say words today, onto the other side. And so very, like when you're watching films, Sometimes the knights are going to have the hood, but they won't necessarily always have that chin strap. It's not really a chin strap. It just comes across. I think the movie Kingdom of Heaven does a fairly good job of portraying what that looks like. And literally like their whole face it's imagine like you're wearing like a sweater or a hoodie, and then you take the straps and you pull the straps taut, and all you can see is like this much of your face. That's kind of what it was like. Many of them would wear helmets. Some of these helmets were just sort of, bucket type helmets, iron helmets. Some had nose guards. There were other helmets that covered the entire face. And then over the chainmail, they would wear this quilted garment, if you will, that reached all the way down to roughly below their knees or at knee level. With all this stuff on, you can imagine that being on foot, you're obviously not very mobile. And in pitch battle, like I said earlier, you're not useless, but you're effectively useless, right? A knight full of armor or covered in armor from head to toe I'm not going to use the analogy that everyone uses, which is like a medieval tank. I don't think that's an accurate portrayal of what they were necessarily, but their strength was on horseback. They were heavy cavalry. And when you had a group of them together and they had shields and lances, it was a very, very difficult enemy to defeat. Moreover, if your army, the backbone of the army were the knights, and if you didn't have knights that you could bring to bear, you are in serious, serious trouble. They all carried swords that were 3 feet in length, double-sided with a hilt, sort of your standard sword that you would see in any popular media or film. The one difference I would say is the tip of the sword typically in film is always blunted. And I'm assuming that's for like safety purposes. In real life, when you actually look at you can go to a website or just Google like an actual sword, they've recovered in a museum, you'll notice that the tips are very, 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 for lack of a better word, pointy, sharp, whatever. Ultimately, the goal of the knight was not to pierce the enemy with the sword, right? So if you're on the horseback, you get your lance. At some point, I assume your lance is going to break, right? There are only so many times. If you knock an enemy off a horse, these things are going to break. And then you would go to your sidearm, which in this case would presumably be a sword, maybe a mace. But your sword is for slashing, really, when you're on horseback. And what you're attempting to do is cut through the chainmail and obviously either kill or wound or dehorse the individual. Like I said, both knights and foot soldiers carried wooden lances with an iron tip that was 6 to 7 feet in length. I do not know why they're called lances and not spears. I don't really understand what the difference is between the two. For whatever reason, in the medieval period, they called them lances, but they were effectively 6 to 7 foot spears. And both knights and foot soldiers would carry some sort of projectile weapon, either in the form of a bow and arrows or a crossbow. I've had mixed sort of information. I've heard that crossbows were very difficult to reload. You'd basically have to be on the ground and like hook your foot into the front of it and then pull with both hands to the rear, and then you put the bolt in. How you would do on a horseback, I have no idea. Maybe it was possible. I doubt it. But obviously, if somebody knows anything about this, by all means, jump in the comment section and tell us what you know. But for whatever reason, crossbows were far more popular than bows, at least in the 11th century in the Iberian Peninsula. The other thing too, all of their armor, all of their gear was obviously very similar, but they were very different. This was not a time in history or a moment in history where there was mass manufacturing. So you basically, as an individual knight with whatever money you could get together, right? Maybe you're super wealthy, not so wealthy. You would have to go hire an individual, presumably a blacksmith, to build your specific armor. So everybody sort of had a unique, distinct look. And yes, there was a lot of crossover, or maybe you would take armor or arms from a defeated individual as booty, and you would use it the next time you were in combat. All this is to say they had a distinct look across the board. Joseph O'Callaghan notes this, quote, several codices illustrate various types of weapons and protective gear. A 12th century miniature in Bataeus commentary depicts soldiers on horseback and on foot wearing conical iron caps and chainmail covering the body, including the head and reaching to the knees. They carried swords, lances, and round shields. A battle scene in Cantiga 63 displays Christian knights wearing chainmail covered with surcoats, gloves, and bold or square helmets shielding the entire face. Their kite shields have distinctive markings such as a zigzag pattern in black and white. A Muslim shield has gold half moons on red, lances with triangular pennons, and a red flag. Around 1,300 murals in the Royal Palace of Barcelona portrayed knights in chainmail with pot helmets, foot soldiers bearing lances and swords, and archers equipped with swords, as well as crossbows and darts and quivers. One of the last things I sort of want to note about all this, owning a horse was essentially like owning a $250,000 race car. They were very expensive to obtain. They were even more expensive over time to maintain. So again, if you had a horse, if you went from being a peasant to a low-level knight, having a horse was a huge difference in terms of what your capabilities were on the battlefield and your capacity to raid. If you are a raider, but you're on foot, you can only go so far. All of a sudden, if you can acquire a horse, which was not uncommon, by the way, when you were raiding, now your ability to go out even further into other villages, maybe the defenses aren't as high because no one expected a raiding Spanish force to come deep within enemy territory across the frontier. If you are successful, you get more booty, you get more money, and you can leverage that to do all kinds of things. Standards and standard bearers, so the guys who are like running around with the lances and they have the pennants and the flags on them, I think they are undersold in film and popular media. And actually, these guys were absolutely critical to the success of any army. Basically, the standard was the guy who was like, hey, rally, I'm the point man, rally on me. And knights are really most efficient and effective when they are together, right? You've got a mass of knights moving versus them all sort of split up and all over the place. So having the standard and having the men drawn to the standard is absolutely critical. Once again, O'Callaghan notes, quote, Guillaume de Montcada, who led the van in the Battle of Portapai, commended his men, quote, let no one separate himself from my standard. And Alfonso VIII ordered his standard bearer to advance into the midst of the Battle of Las Navas to hearten the troops. Standards varied in size and shape in accordance with a person's rank. Royal standards more than likely were similar to royal seals. Another sort of fascinating thing too, that again, I think gets completely missed in books and other, popular media shows, television, whatever. You had religious clerics, bishops, men of the church who would join the army as they went out and weren't just there to like say a prayer before they died and went on the battlefield. Many of them were warrior monks. Many of them actually fought. Many of them were knights. And not only that, they were like knights dedicated to specific churches or orders, so that if a king was going to war, he would go to the church or to a bishop and say, hey, I need X amount of soldiers and we'll pay you whatever, and et cetera, et cetera. And they would bring, a host of potentially, 50 knights with them. And they were all monks, but they were knights, which I think is totally awesome. It's like medieval boondock saints, right? Anamati Patre Spiritu Santo. They're out there smoking fools and lighting up suckers, but they're bishops and they're monks. I mean, I don't know. There's something about that I absolutely love. And then finally, typically the army was broken up in the vanguard, which was the main sort of central fighting force. And then you had the rear guard, and then you had the flanking detachments as well. And that's kind of a generalization, but that's fundamentally how the sort of different regiments within the army were broken down. Okay. So back to our narrative of El Cid. The death of Sancho, King Sancho, was, again, a bit of a mystery. There was some kind of conspiracy afoot, or at least that's what everyone believed, up to and including the Cid. And of course, they all suspected that his brother, King Alfonso, played some kind of part in the death of his brother. Despite all of this, King Alfonso makes a decision of, hey, instead of exiling El Cid, and potentially making him a threat to myself and my kingdom, I am going to absorb him, even at the risk that he knows, or he may speculate, that I played a part in my brother's death. And he does this. He brings him in and, quote, received El Cid with honor as his vassal and kept him in his entourage with very respectful affection. So this is just so interesting. So you have these two brothers, these two kings that were fighting against one another. King Sancho's right-hand man, the guy who was like a brother to him, goes after his death, ends up going and fighting for, I want to say his arch rival, but certainly a primary rival. And to sort of crystallize this relationship between King Alfonso and El Cid, the king has the champion marry a female relative of his named Jimena. And obviously the ultimate goal there is to crystallize their relationship in hopes that, you know, Alfonso wants El Cid to be completely loyal to him. And the way very often that kings would do this, or vassals or whatever, was they would have some sort of intermarriage with their family and some sort of ally. At this point now, Rodrigo is working for King Alfonso as some sort of a military commander / ambassador. And so one of the first sort of operations that he has him do is he goes out and collects tribute, taxes from, you know, you could also call it extortion money, from their subjects in and around their realm, if you will. And he's very successful. He comes back, he does what he needs to do. And the next sort of task that King Alfonso gives him is there is this, because again, we're in the frontier zone. So you have Islamic forces coming in from the south and raiding all throughout Castile. So King Alfonso goes to Rodrigo and says, hey, I need you to go quell this rebellion and prevent this army from doing any further harm or damage to my subjects. We discover that Rodrigo is sick. He's on bed rest of some kind, and for one reason or another, therefore, cannot go out and quell this rebellion. And while this is happening, the Saracen army lays waste to a location outside of Toledo called Gormaz, which is a municipality or town, if you will. And there was a castle there. They raid it. They take all the booty. But unbeknownst to the raiders, obviously, Gormaz, it appears as though, was Rodrigo's direct responsibility. And so he sees this as a slight against him. He is clearly embarrassed, although the text doesn't come out and say that or admit that. But rather than going to King Alfonso and saying, hey, I'm going to go seek revenge for what they did to our land, to my responsibility, he goes out on his own. He raises his army. They go out and they completely lay waste to other Saracen Islamic territories around Toledo. And he appears to have gone a bit overboard, and they end up taking 7,000 captives, up to and including civilians. And also it specifically states that Rodrigo lays waste to this region. Now, a couple points I want to make. And again, I'm sort of repeating some themes here. The nature and willingness of these vassals, these knights, of going out and raiding without getting the approval from the king was obviously very problematic, but also it was the nature of this frontier war. So it wasn't completely uncommon that this kind of thing happened. And in particular, when it was against Islamic forces, despite the fact, of course, that these Islamic forces were now subject to Christian kings. Now, just to read it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I will. Love you. You're leaving. Okay. Okay. See you, pal. So just to sort of, again, I'm repeating myself here, but it's really important to remember there are a whole variety of ways knights, war fighting men, were able to make money. Some of them own land. They could collect rents and tenants. Others, especially later on in the sort of Reconquest program, they started to receive stipends from their lord kings in order to facilitate their raiding and war making capabilities. I did some sort of janky math based on the information that I was getting from the historians. Knights could receive a stipend of $40,000 to roughly $80,000 in today's money, but they would augment their income by raiding and taking loot and booty and whatever they could sort of get their hands on. And so when Rodrigo and his army goes out and lays waste and collects these captives, you know, again, this is the incentive there is obviously both economic in terms of getting loot and filling their coffers, but simultaneously, this is indeed a revenge moment for him for what the Saracens did while he was, you know, quote unquote, not feeling well, I suppose. Angus Mackay in his book, Spain in the Medieval Period, he says, quote, "The cantor or epic is plainly obsessed," meaning the manuscript, the history of Rodrigo, with the problem of how warriors made a living, a theme which is both historically realistic yet fits in well with the story. Propertylessness and in exile, the Cid tells his men that they must keep moving, quote, "For we must live by our swords and lances, otherwise in this lean land we could not survive, and in my opinion, we must move on." Spoiler alert, he gets exiled in a second here, as we'll get into. All of this sort of program of constant warfare, raiding, economic incentives vis-a-vis raiding and attacking your enemies, that sort of cultural paradigm that existed was very different than the rest of Europe. And so much as, yes, other European armies would go out and they would raid and they would fill their coffers with whatever loot they could get their hands on. But this was a staple in the economic infrastructure within the Iberian Peninsula. And because of that, it sort of helps explain one of the ways, or one of the reasons why the Spanish reconquest was so successful over not just one generation, but all the generations over the course of legitimately hundreds of years. There's a lot of other reasons why the Spanish people were able to reclaim their lost territory. But again, this is just one of the key features that allowed them to facilitate this ongoing war and motivate men from all different classes, right? From the lowest end of the socioeconomic classes to the wealthiest men to go out and raid and continue to commit to warfare against their Muslim enemies. According to the chronicles, King Alfonso's court is absolutely livid. Why are they mad at Rodrigo for doing what he did? Well, specifically because the individuals who he attacked, the individuals that he took captive, were their subjects. They were their tenants. They were paying them, so much money every year. And when Rodrigo went out and attacked these individuals, it did two things. Number one, it obviously took away their tax base because these people can no longer work and therefore pay their tribute. But number two, presumably it would have enraged the Islamic individuals, the Muslims within the region. And so the likelihood that they would now revolt in retaliation to what Rodrigo did was increasingly higher and higher. And so basically these courtiers are going to Alfonso and they're saying, hey, you've got to get rid of this guy, right? Like, he is out of control. You did not permit him or give him the authority to go out and do this. He completely did it on his own, autonomously. That's not the way the rules work. That's not what you're supposed to do. And so eventually they are able to convince King Alfonso that he basically has to excise Rodrigo and his knights from the realm. It is worth noting there's some subtext here. Obviously, King Alfonso, despite the fact that he's brought Rodrigo into his court, into his entourage, there is still this fear that exists that because of his relationship, Rodrigo's relationship with his brother, now dead, King Sancho, that there is this sort of mistrust between the two. And so King Alfonso is always hesitant and weary of the potential that Rodrigo is never going to fully buy into his new court because he is still more aligned with and committed to King Sancho, despite the fact that he is indeed dead. Also, there is one more thing worth mentioning, and I'm going to actually read you the quote in a second here, but it appears as though the courtiers, the author mentions that they're older, right? They're older in age specifically. And so therefore, what I'm sort of deducing from this is they no longer can raid or go on the warpath in the way that Rodrigo can. And so their capacity to make money waging war in whatever fashion that comes in, to take booty, to take loot from their enemies, has been seriously diminished. And so they are, quote unquote, jealous of Rodrigo's not only capability and military prowess, but simply that he's young, his youth allows him to go out and raid and have supplementary income with all the other avenues that he's making money from. And so the author states, quote, "When King Alfonso and the elders of his court heard of this exploit of Rodrigo, they were gravely displeased. The courtiers who were envious of him held it against him and said with one voice to the king, quote, 'Lord King, your highness must surely know that Rodrigo perpetrated this in order that all of us who live together in Saracen territory to take tribute from it will be killed by the Saracens and will die there.' The king was unjustly impressed and angered by this wicked and envious accusation. He expelled Rodrigo from his kingdom." The last sort of note I want to make about this little scene is that clearly the king is highly influenced by his courtiers. So, as I said earlier in the episode, kings were not completely tyrannical necessarily. They always sought counsel with their entourage, and they worked together to come up with whatever sort of decisions they needed to in order to run the kingdom or the realm. And the sort of last thing I would say about this entire situation is that, according to Richard Fletcher in his book, The Quest for El Cid, he argues, and I sort of made this point, but it's worth mentioning, that Alfonso is weary of his relationship with El Cid. He's clearly a force to be reckoned with. And this is sort of seen as an opportune moment to excise him out of his court and out of his realm, and hopefully get rid of him completely. And he may or may not die on campaign, because, again, in order to survive, he's got no property. He has no revenue. As I quoted him earlier, he's got to go out and effectively become some kind of a mercenary of sorts in order just to not only pay himself and keep himself alive, but the lives of his men also require this constant raiding to make money to indeed survive. Because of all this opportunity of raiding, because there are so many men who are of military caliber that are incentivized to go out and conduct this ongoing reconquest of Spain, it is, like I said, for the millionth time, it's providing economic opportunity for themselves and their men. As they grow wealthier, they obviously become stronger. They obviously become more powerful. They can bring on more men to their retinue to go wage war. And so these things just sort of snowball as these individuals, like Rodrigo El Cid, gain popularity, have more successes. They organically become opposition, whether they mean to or not, towards their kings and their lords. And so there's this friction point between wanting your men to be successful on campaign and to go out on these expeditions and indeed to raid along the frontier. But at the same time, you have to somehow keep them in check, because if they become too wealthy and they have too many men in their army, they now are a threat to you and your authority or in your capacity as king to oversee and rule your kingdom and your realm. And this is going to fester and sort of become malignant to King Alfonso as El Cid just continues to be successful on military campaigns. Okay, we are going to pick it up from there in our next episode. Like I said, El Cid is now cast into the wilderness, and he has to sort of figure out a way to bring himself either back into the court of King Alfonso or simply go do something else and work for another lord. We're going to talk all about that next time. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society.